From Joe Rogan saying that the Soviets are responsible for Yoel Romero's superhuman body, to some claiming that Conor McGregor works for an Irish mob, these are the most insane UFC fighter conspiracies. Joe Rogan has a reputation for saying crazy things, but nothing beats his theory about Romero. On the 119th episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, the UFC commentator invited Michael Bisping, and soon they started talking about the Count's former middleweight rival, Yoel. Joe kicked things off by telling Bisping about what happened with the Cuban when he had to fight in Australia. Romero had suffered a cracked orbital, so the UFC sent him over to a doctor who was amazed by Yoel, to say the least. After examining the fighter, the doctor called the UFC asking, "Where did you find this guy?" The doctor then went on to say that he was serious with his question, because he's been studying humans for years and has been operating on them for multiple decades. Yet Yoel was something he'd never seen before. According to the doctor, the tendons in the Cuban's eye are 3 times thicker than the average person's. So when he reached the doctor, his eye was already healing. Rogan then gave us his theory on Romero, saying that since he came out of the Cuban sports program, who the fuck knows what kind of experiments they were doing? He continued that they experimented with all sorts of steroids and PEDs to enhance their athletes, before saying, "The Soviets did it for sure, 100%. While Joe thinks the Soviets are behind Romero's freakish strength, most other conspiracies are based on the UFC's involvement, sort of like the one about the UFC ensuring Henderson and Woodley wouldn't fight on TUF 9. Before Dana White's Contender Series, TUF was the only way to discover rising stars. But could TUF have also produced Benson Henderson and Tyron Woodley? One conspiracy theory suggests so. The 2009 season of TUF had 2 teams, one of American talent while the other was made of UK-based fighters. According to the theory, the UFC wanted both winners to come from the UK so that they could continue growing their market in the area. In order to achieve that, they turned down some of the more talented fighters from America, including future champs Woodley and Henderson. The theory definitely has some truth to it. We all know Benson applied for the show since his audition tape was leaked online, while Woodley's application to the show was mentioned during his run at Strikeforce. That said, you could also say the theory is a bit of a stretch since both men were still relatively inexperienced. Plus, Spike TV rather than the UFC itself was responsible for selecting the TUF fighters, and they made their choices based on whether the athletes' personalities stood out. But hey, even if the theory's true, at least Tyron and Benson's careers weren't really negatively affected by it. Though I can't say the same thing about the next theory because TJ Grant's career wasn't the same after the UFC 164 controversy. You see, the UFC isn't exactly known for being based on merit, so Dana White's privilege is a very real thing. In 2013, not only was it being claimed that Dana offered a shot to a non-deserving fighter, but that he paid off the rightful contender, TJ Grant, in order to do so. In the summer of 2013, the UFC planned on having Jose Aldo defend his featherweight title against Pettis, while Benson Henderson was set to defend the 155-pound belt against Grant. Soon after, Pettis pulled out with a knee injury, while Grant had to forgo the title shot because of a concussion. The Korean Zombie took Showtime's place against Aldo, but when it came to finding a replacement for Henderson, the UFC gave the opportunity to Pettis. Conspiracies started flying around like crazy, with many claiming that the UFC paid Grant off so that Anthony could get a title shot which he had missed out on against Jose. Fans were quick to believe this, especially because of how quickly Showtime recovered from the injury, though Grant tried to clear things up when he tweeted that no amount of money could have convinced him to give up the title shot. Whatever the case, TJ never fought again after all of this happened. 9 years later, the UFC found itself involved in another conspiracy theory following UFC 279. For better or for worse, the UFC 279 fight week was one for the ages, and with all the controversy surrounding the event, it's not surprising that people came up with theories about what unfolded. The main event was supposed to feature Khamzat Chimaev versus Nate Diaz at 170 pounds, while the co-main was set to feature Tony Ferguson and Li Jingliang at welterweight as well. But Boers missed weight by nearly 9 pounds, so the UFC was forced to switch things up on the fly, leading to Khamzat and Kevin Holland fighting in a catchweight bout for the co-main, and Tony battling it out against Nate at 170 for the main event. According to Brendan Schaub, the UFC itself advised Chimaev to show up over the weight limit since the event wasn't creating enough buzz, so when they switched things up at the last second, the promotion was able to get more eyes on the event. Dana obviously got pissed and shot the theory down while talking about it, saying that the show was already sold out. But again, you never really know what's actually going on behind the scenes. I can say the same thing for many of the theories centered around fighters missing weight, sort of like the Daniel Cormier situation at UFC 210. When he was set to defend his title against Anthony Johnson, DC was 1.2 pounds over the limit at the official weigh-in. But then once he came back out to the scale just a few minutes later, he miraculously weighed in at the 205-pound limit, though it didn't take long for people to start theorizing about what actually went down. You see, when he came back to the scale the second time he could be seen pressing down on the towel that was covering him, so many fans accused the former champ of cheating in order to make weight. Daniel kept denying these claims and said that the theory made no sense. But once he retired, he did kinda admit to there being some truth to it. However, when it comes to Nick Diaz's theory about Georges St-Pierre, it just seems like he was being a grade A hater. Everyone was dying to see GSP and Nick face off, and when they finally did at UFC 158, the Canadian easily defeated the Stockton native. Diaz was obviously annoyed, and his resentment towards Georges refused to go away because 2 years after their fight, he claimed that GSP, as the hometown hero, was given a lot of help from the Quebec Athletic Commission. He claimed that not only did they brush over the fact that St-Pierre was 3 pounds above the limit, but that he took steroids and wasn't drug tested properly. We all know GSP was super honest and would have never taken steroids, plus he never failed a drug test. As for the weight, it seems impossible that anyone would have allowed him to fight while being 3 pounds above the limit. But believe it or not, this wasn't the first time GSP was accused of cheating. You guessed it, I'm talking about Greasegate. When Georges and BJ Penn met in what was a highly anticipated super fight at UFC 94, Penn surprisingly only went for 1 takedown. After the match, the former champ said that it was because of GSP's body being covered in too much Vaseline, which made it almost impossible for BJ to effectively grapple with St-Pierre. Many spectators did see GSP's coach Phil Nurse covering his chest and back with Vaseline. But when Penn filed a complaint with the Nevada State Athletic Commission, their executive director Keith Kaiser shot down Penn's claims entirely. So now Penn looked like an even bigger fool. The theory wasn't completely nonsensical, and GSP haters happily believe Penn, but this next conspiracy theory is so wild that you'll think I'm lying to you about it. Believe it or not, some claim that Conor McGregor has ties to an Irish mob. According to this theory, Mystic Mac's pub, the Black Forge Inn, is nothing but a front used by the Kinahan crime family's drug business. What's more, the theory claims that Conor is forced to launder their money against his own will. How'd the theory come about? Well, it all started when the pub was attacked by a petrol bomb early in 2022, leading to a post being published on Reddit. And this post had a ton of details that made it impossible for you to discount the theory as being fake. The theory naturally gained a lot of traction, but McGregor himself never said anything about it. Some weren't willing to believe it, while most fans said that there were too many coincidences for us to debunk it. After all, one Twitter user even pointed out that Conor has a well-documented relationship with some Irish mob members, and posted a photo in which the Notorious can be seen with people of the crime group. So, from some claiming that Conor McGregor works for an Irish mob, to Joe Rogan claiming that the Soviets are responsible for Yoel Romero's superhuman body, those were the most insane UFC fighter conspiracies.